During her long and distinguished career, Georgia O'Keeffe pioneered an artistic style that dominated the art of 20th century America. Unique in its organic, abstract expression, her vision and passion identify her as a lifelong master of modern art. Born in the Midwest, O'Keeffe studied art in Virginia, Chicago, and eventually in New York City, where she came of age as an artist in the 1920s and 1930s. There, she soon became associated with photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz. He had recognized her talent from the start and immediately showed some of her work at his gallery, 291. Thus began a long, intense relationship, which was to benefit them both in their prolific and varied careers. With crystalline clarity and a vivid, sensuous feeling for both objects and landscapes, O'Keeffe painted life studies that were to distinguish her as an original and adventurous painter. Her studies of flowers, bones, cityscapes, and southwestern landscapes have become some of the most recognizable images in modern art. After Stieglitz's death in 1946, O'Keeffe moved permanently to New Mexico, and in exploring her love of the natural world, found perhaps her truest expression in paint. Her reputation continued to grow, and her life devoted to art remains a great influence on American painting today. Rabbit and Copper Pot, Still Life with Hair, 1907, oil on canvas. This work is one of the rare extant paintings made while O'Keeffe was studying with William Merritt Chase at the Art Student League in New York. In 1923, O'Keeffe wrote of that time, "I loved the color in the brass and copper pots and pans, peppers, onions, and other things we painted for him." In 1910, at the age of 23, a severe bout of the measles temporarily blinded her, and she was forced to give up her career as a graphic artist. O'Keeffe returned to her family in Virginia to recover. O'Keeffe's first artistic crisis lasted until she was 24. In 1912, she enrolled briefly at the University of Virginia, where her sisters were taking art classes. Her sister encouraged her to come hear the revolutionary art instructor, Alain Bement. Alain Bement had studied the Dow method, which encouraged students to produce original work instead of copying the works of others. Dow wrote, "That which anybody can do is not worth doing. If your drawing is just like your neighbor's, it has no value as art." This belief became the foundation of O'Keeffe's art. That autumn in 1912, at the age of 25, O'Keeffe moved to Amarillo, Texas. She began teaching art for the first time for 2 years in a local high school. In 1914, at the age of 27, O'Keeffe joined the National Woman's Party. Although she never claimed to be a feminist, her early efforts towards equality were notable. In 1915, at the age of 28, while teaching art in South Carolina, O'Keeffe took stock of her career. The artist hung all her paintings in a room and performed a monumental self-evaluation of her work. O'Keeffe by then had studied at several schools around the country under notable teachers of the time. She concluded that each one of her paintings was derivative of these influences, and so destroyed every piece. The destruction of her paintings led O'Keeffe to produce a flurry of new drawings, done entirely in her singular expressionist way. In December of 1915, at the age of 28, she sent some of these spare abstract charcoal drawings to Anita Pulitzer. Pulitzer was struck by the promise and sensitiveness of the drawings. Though O'Keeffe had instructed her friend not to show the charcoal studies to anyone, Pulitzer took the drawings to Alfred Stieglitz. He was a noted photographer and one of America's foremost promoters of modern art. To Stieglitz, the drawings came as a revelation. He saw a new expression of things felt, a new beauty in O'Keeffe's work. He was so impressed that he exhibited her drawings without having first received O'Keeffe's permission. During a visit to New York, she descended on the gallery in anger and demanded that her private drawings be returned. Stieglitz persuaded her to allow the exhibit to remain standing. Abstraction 9, 1916, Charcoal on Paper. By 1916, O'Keefe, a portraitist from an early age, was able to reduce the likeness of her fellow student and friend, Dorothy True, to a few essential forms. The swirling lines represent the ever-present cigarette smoke surrounding Dorothy. Yet this composition also displays the simple series of curves and shaded planes, representative of the painter's other early abstractions. O'Keefe's love of nature was surely inspired by her childhood in Wisconsin. She was born on November 15, 1887 in Sun Prairie. She grew up among the hundreds of acres of her family's large dairy farm. She called her homeland in the Midwest the normal, healthy part of America, and credits it as the foundation for the development of her art. Blue Lines 10, 1916, watercolor on paper. Stieglitz once referred to this painting as an embodiment of sexual principles, but for O'Keefe, it was the ultimate in a series of linear abstractions. The lines and colors have been composed so that they impart a distinct message. This practice O'Keefe called the very basis of painting. O'Keefe's mother encouraged early art instruction for all 5 of her daughters, just as she herself and O'Keefe's grandmother before her had. Evening Star 3, 1917, watercolor on paper. Beginning with pale washes that blended one into another, she gradually heightened the intensity of the color until the entire paper was saturated with pigment. She painted the sunlight falling on the vast plains at various times of day. She enjoyed harmonizing strident colors, using the force of her hues to convey the full impact of a spectacular sunset or sunrise. She even experimented in how far to separate the strokes in order to keep the tints pure. In 1918, Stieglitz managed to convince O'Keefe to give up her teaching post in Texas and return to New York in order to paint. Stieglitz was 23 years older than she, who was then a 30-year-old schoolteacher. O'Keefe had had enough of struggling to create her art and accepted Stieglitz's offer of financial support for a year to paint. But 1 year turned into several decades, and Stieglitz continued to provide financial and professional support. With the support of Stieglitz and the help of early positive reviews and sales, O'Keefe was able to devote herself entirely to painting. She created abstractions that attempted to capture the sensations of the Texas plain, the innovative construction of New York City skyscrapers at night, the rural landscapes and still lifes of Lake George, and of course, the gorgeous flowers for which she would become famous. All were produced in the brilliant light-filled colors and meticulously delineated patterns she found through her resolute study of details. From 1918 to 1930, O'Keefe painted at least 24 scenes of New York. The pictures in these series seemed to push for wider vistas, as if the artist was trying to break through the bustle of the city to find the underlying universals she so yearned to express. O'Keefe played with these hard edges and contrasting planes of colored light, finding abstract patterns in the skyline and even in the electric signs that glowed in the night. Blue and Green Music, 1919, oil on canvas. This composition illustrates O'Keefe's attempt to convey sound through a radiated burst of waving lines. She usually did a series of paintings on the same subject, exploring the physical complexities of an object in order to render it in more subtle ways. Gradually, she reached toward molding the patterns and shapes through gradation of color rather than line. O'Keefe was gravitating toward naturally inherent patterns. By focusing on fundamental lines, she found she could remain constant to the essence of the object, even in abstract renderings. She often painted fragments of things because it seemed to make her statement as well as or better than the whole. Red and Orange Streak, 1919, oil on canvas. O'Keefe desired to capture the essence of a landscape through color. In this painting, the central slash of light draws upon the dazzle of the last rays of sunlight, while the undulating skyline evokes a sense of activity over the plains and the sounds of evening in Panhandle country. Red Cana, 1919, watercolor on paper. This watercolor is an enlarged detail of a cross-section of a canna flower, flattened into the abstract essence of its form. The surging lines radiate in a burst pattern that is similar to the painter's abstract forms. However, there is a new fluidity to her colors here that help her create a lively, resonating feeling. The decorative patterns of colors are focused on deep within the recesses of the flower. When OKeefe began painting apples around 1920, she abandoned the traditional realistic still life setting and placed the plate and apple on a white void. By isolating the subject, the viewer is forced to look at the objects themselves rather than their relation to their surroundings. My Shanty, Lake George, 1922, oil on canvas. This is OKeefe's only painting of the humble building at Lake George that had been turned into her art studio. This became a place where she could get away from vacationing family and friends and just paint. The dark colors in this painting are unusual for OKeefe and reflect the palette of her fellow modernists at that time. She says she was inspired by the thought of working on a dismal colored painting like The Men. Spring, 1922, oil on canvas. This stylized design consists of an abstract pattern of simplified organic shapes. The strong bar of darkness slashing through the canvas is reminiscent of OKeefe's early attempts to evoke movement and sound, while the rising peak with a burst of white simulates the rhythm of new growth. In 1923, Stieglitz presented 100 of OKeefe's pictures at the Anderson Gallery on Park Avenue. OKeefe was not fond of having her work displayed. I say that I do not want to have this exhibition because, among other reasons, there are so many exhibitions that it seems ridiculous for me to add to the mess. But I guess I'm lying. I probably want to see my things hang on a wall as other things hang, so as to be able to place them in my mind in relation to other things I have seen done. And I presume, if I must be honest, that I am also interested in what anybody else has to say about them, and also in what they don't say, because that means something to me too. Green Oak Leaves, 1923, oil on canvas mounted on wood. Here, OKeefe has painted a cluster of oak leaves, focusing on the sense of pulsing vitality that is created merely by the irregular outline and the fine gradations of vibrant green. Rather than attempting to achieve a pattern of vitality through many leaves, she focused upon 2 or 3 overlapping varieties, creating a more static composition. Stieglitz and OKeefe, at the age of 37, married in October of 1924. Flower Abstraction, 1924, oil on canvas. In this vertical motif, the center of the flower seems to merge with the cloudy sky, taking the viewer into the flower and beyond. OKeefe ushers us into the misty, innermost heart of the blossom to discover the vibrating white light of life flowing like a river from the heart of the image. Trees were a subject OKeefe explored throughout her entire life. She attempted to simplify her renderings of trees through isolated details of trunks and branches. In the mid-1920s, she focused on the smooth, bare trunks and branches of the Lake George trees. From the Lake, number 3, 1924, oil on canvas. Color was a primary area of exploration, as she discovered she could evoke moods and impressions through her palette. OKeefe's colors harmonize despite the brilliant varying hues that glow like jewels on the canvas. Ruby reds, violets, and emerald greens shade into startling orange and yellow. The autumn greenery is taken to abstract heights, rendering the vibrancy of the moving water through chips of blue-white light and ripples of verdant green and tawny gold. New York with Moon, 1925, oil on canvas. Here, the endless sky is sharply cut by dark angles, as if every pinch of cloud-filled void was precious enough to capture. The bright streetlight below competes with the light from the sky as a distracting and constant presence. Within this work's somber mood is the underlying construction of split verticals and mirrored fragments, a pattern she found so often in nature. In late 1925, OKeefe and Stieglitz moved to an upper floor of the Shelton Hotel. It was the first setback skyscraper in New York. From the windows, OKeefe suddenly had a bird's-eye view of the patterns of the city. Petunia, 1925, Oil on Board. This composition looks directly into the heart of the intensely rich blossom. The magenta hues are velvety in their richness, shading quite naturally into deep purple and violet shadows. The flower has been separated from its natural environment, rendering it against the undulating white backdrop. By liberating the flower from its place in landscape, OKeefe was able to concentrate on the unique patterns within, allowing the viewer to do so as well. In 1926, OKeefe addressed a political party convention in Washington, at which time she also lobbied Eleanor Roosevelt during the campaign for an Equal Rights Amendment. OKeefe believed that no child should be barred from any activity that they may choose based on their sex. Black Iris 3, 1926, Oil on Canvas. OKeefe wrote that she magnified her flowers because nobody sees a flower really. It is so small we haven't the time. She decided that if her flowers were large enough, even busy New Yorkers would have to take time to see what she saw in the blossoms. Stieglitz and OKeefe's separation during the 1926 National Woman's Party Convention was the first of what became frequent and long seasons spent apart from each other. City Night, 1926, Oil on Canvas. This painting shows the reduction of the basic skyscraper pattern that OKeefe painted during the 1920s. Its vertical motifs vibrate with the excitement of the city, while a somber mood is evoked by the penetrating night sky. East River Drive, No. 1, 1926, Oil on Linen. In this work, the vast expanse of soot-gray warehouses and factories stretches to the blurry horizon, evoking a melancholy mood. When OKeefe began to talk about trying to render the view over the city from their windows at the Shelton, she was told that it was an impossible idea. Even the men had not done too well with this subject. Lake George Barnes, 1926, Oil on Canvas. OKeefe realized that it was not only the form of a subject that mattered. She understood that for a thing to be painted well, the artist's feelings about the subject must be expressed in addition to the object itself. A landscape could be gloomy or cheerful, depending on how the artist herself chose to reflect her own feelings. For her, the numerous studies of barns she painted were healthy Midwestern symbols and reminders of her happy childhood. Pink Tulip, 1926, Oil on Canvas. OKeefe painted her flowers so that viewers could look at something familiar in a new way. She surely was not expecting critics to write that they seem a clear case of Freudian suppressed desires in paint. Shell and Shingle 6, 1926, Oil on Canvas. OKeefe attempted to distill objects into the essence. She wanted to convey, through line and color, a reflection that was pure, intense, and as direct as life itself. She created a formal language for the pure expression of nature, and she found the basic patterns of nature in bud-shaped forms, vertical rayed bursts, and organic spirals. When she turned her rare vision on other objects, such as shells and leaves, OKeefe found repeating patterns within different subjects. The Shelton with Sunspots, 1926, Oil on Canvas. OKeefe's primary source of inspiration was nature, as evident in this work. The dominating impression is the powerful force of the sun. Though only yellow peaks around the impenetrable form of the skyscraper, the light and color is cast in such a blinding brilliance that the skyscraper seems insubstantial. Abstraction Blue, 1927, Oil on Canvas. The pointed shaft sharply divides this composition, yet the soft focus of the color suggests clouds and landscape. OKeefe's abstractions from the 1920s often reflect Stieglitz's photographic series of cloud and landscape elements, which he called his equivalents. Line and Curve, 1927, oil on canvas. OKeefe constantly wondered if she was successfully conveying what she wanted to through her paintings. As early as 1916, writing to Stieglitz, she asked him what he thought of her charcoals, saying, "I made them just to express myself, things I feel and want to say but haven't words for." Radiator Building, Night, New York. 1927, oil on canvas. The strong base of the building can be compared to the trees of Lake George. This was something OKeefe was also painting around the same time, with rayed light and smoke diffusing the boundary between earth and sky. Stieglitz's name replaces the real neon sign. Red Hills, Lake George, The Red Hills with Sun, 1927, oil on canvas. OKeefe inspired Stieglitz's photographs of the 1920s, which focused on nature, clouds, the moon, even lightning. These images he had never before photographed. This image shows one of the many vistas OKeefe opened up to his inquiring mind. White Rose with Larkspur, number 2, 1927, oil on canvas. What interested OKeefe was not just the flower itself, but the colors and shapes within the flower. Here is a spiral into the heart of the flower, with shadows evoked as if they were petals themselves. They were substantial in their ability to merge the individual petals into a swirling, living entity. The very heart is softened, as if to emphasize the difficulty in truly, wholly seeing into the depths of a single flower. East River from the Shelton, 1927-1928, oil on canvas. The organic forms of OKeefe's contemporary flower studies emerge in the soft folds of the river, which dominate the misty, smoke-filled landscape beyond Manhattan. Oriental Poppies, 1928, oil on canvas. While working on her paintings, OKeefe would often turn them to make sure the composition was balanced from every direction. This particular work was exhibited for a long time, with the poppies appearing on top of one another, rather than in its proper horizontal orientation. Yellow Hickory Leaves with Daisy, 1928, oil on canvas. Flowers, as well as bones, became for OKeefe almost an alphabet for expressing her special way of looking at the universe. The leaves remain highly structured, using color and expressive brushwork to convey their natural, realistic vitality. Two calla lilies on pink, 1928, oil on canvas. OKeefe's fellow artists, Marston Hartley and Charles Demuth, inspired her to paint flowers. However, her paintings generated far more Freudian commentary from spectators. Perhaps it was because of her startling methods of enlargement and because she was a woman. Stieglitz, in the midst of the fevered commentary of OKeefe's flowers, referred to her calla lily paintings as the Immaculate Conception. OKeefe decided to try a calla lily to see if I could understand what it was all about. The prominent stamen was sometimes described in masculine symbols, while the smooth roundness of the bell-shaped petal evoked feminine associations. In 1929, OKeefe traveled to New Mexico to spend her first summer in blessed isolation in order to paint. Thus began a cycle that would last for almost 2 decades, spending winters with Stieglitz in New York and summers in her beloved desert. Black Cross, New Mexico, 1929, oil on canvas. Here, the central portion of the cross hovers over OKeefe's beloved desert. The middle ground is dropped out of existence, while the intense foreground detail contrasts with the undulating hills at the horizon. OKeefe admired the strength it took to live in the desert. The blinding sunlight of the American West posed problems for some artists, but OKeefe glorified in their intensity. She noted that all the colors of the spectrum were possible in the intense white light. She also enjoyed the sweeping views, the spare majesty of the untouched earth, and the beauty of the mountains and mesas. The artist found that the patterns changed with the sunlight, creating new images with every hour and season. Black Hollyhock, Blue Larkspur, 1929, oil on canvas. The lush velvet petals of the black hollyhock enclose a center of light, burning like a sun. The intensity of OKeefe's colors was extreme and offended those who were accustomed to viewing artwork with a more conventionally subdued palette. Stieglitz and OKeefe were obviously in love for their entire lives. They wrote frequently during their separations and confided their feelings about things both personal and professional. Gray Cross with Blue, 1929, oil on canvas. Despite her Catholic background, OKeefe did not paint crosses as religious symbols, but simply as an image that pervaded the attitudes of the people in the Southwest. She once told a critic that anyone who doesn't feel the crosses simply doesn't get that country. The Lawrence Tree, 1929, oil on canvas. The unusual perspective of this painting instantly orients the viewer so that one is standing beneath the tree. In this way, OKeefe creates an equivalent to her experience of the grandeur of the desert night. Soft Gray, All-Called Hill, near All-Called, New Mexico, 1929 to 1930, oil on canvas. Painted during her first trip to New Mexico, this work is the artist's response to the magnificence of the countryside, emphasizing the size of the low, symmetrical hill. OKeefe was much more interested in capturing the texture of the swells than in rendering an exact reproduction. During her second summer in the New Mexico desert, OKeefe began to notice the bones baked white by the intense sun. The same regard for colored texture that gave her flowers such vibrant life was applied to the weathered bones that had been polished to a gleam by wind-blown sand. Apple Blossoms, 1930, oil on canvas. OKeefe considered color to be one of the things that makes life worth living. She thought of her painting as a way to create an equivalent with paint, color for the world, life as I see it. Horse's Skull on Blue, 1930, oil on canvas. OKeefe said of her series of bone paintings that bones are as beautiful as anything I know. To me, they are strangely more living than the animals walking around. Hair, eyes, and all. My Backyard, 1930, oil on canvas. Attracted by the beautiful and lonely vistas of the Southwest, OKeefe called the cliffs and canyons of New Mexico my backyard. Although Stieglitz did not accompany her there during their years together, he knew that the landscape was necessary for her art. Near Apicu, New Mexico, 1930, oil on canvas. The soft organic forms of the hills near Apicu swell from the barren landscape into the limitless sky above. These hills are almost alive, and they breathe and move with the incredible landscape. Rancho's Church, 1930, oil on canvas. Many artists have done studies of the Rancho's Church in Taos. The buttressing of the apse is engineering at a simple geometric level, and the smooth rounded walls give the blocky plains a vaguely organic appearance. Bear Lake, Desert Abstraction, 1931, oil on canvas. Completed soon after OKeefe had begun her visits to the Southwest, this early abstract work built around light on the mountains truly distances in layers. Cow's Skull, Red, White, and Blue, 1931, oil on canvas. OKeefe wrote that the inspiration for this particular painting were the cattle in Amarillo, Texas. She considered the scene to be important and uniquely American, deciding, just for fun, I will make it red, white, and blue, a new kind of flag almost. Cow's Skull with Calico Roses, 1931, oil on canvas. In the hollows of the bones OKeefe painted were openings to a new dimension where light and color ruled in an increased intensity. She did not look upon bones as symbols of death, but rather of longevity and survival. OKeefe with Skull Painting, 1931, photograph. In an effort to bring the New Mexico desert to the city, OKeefe sent barrels full of bones back to New York. She spoke of them as her treasures and created many of her bone paintings during the winter months in New York. The White Calico Flower, 1931, oil on canvas. By the 1920s, OKeefe had become one of the most famous artists in America. This was due to the popularity of her dramatic paintings of gigantic flowers, which magnified their subjects in a new and startling fashion. White Trumpet Flower, 1932, oil on canvas. In 1937, OKeefe discussed her method of painting flowers, saying, "At the time, it seemed to me as though the flower I was painting was the only thing in the world. I didn't think of it as small. In this work, a sharper, more realistic line is present, emphasizing formal boldness of line, color, and design." After being away for 3 years, OKeefe returned to her beloved New Mexico. In 1934, at the age of 47, she explored the North region and found Ghost Ranch. Here was a place she returned to numerous times. She immediately rented a one-room cottage lit by kerosene lamps, ate at the lodge, and spent all day outdoors. Barn with Snow, 1934, oil on canvas. This was one of the first paintings OKeefe completed while she was recuperating from a long hospitalization for psychoneurosis. Fittingly, she chose to paint a barn covered with snow, representing her own hibernation, as if she and the barn both were lying in wait for the quickening sun and warmth of a southwestern spring. Rib and Jawbone, 1935, oil on wood. Here, in a simple and representational rendering, are some of the bones that OKeefe found so inspiring as subjects for her work. Gray Hill Forms, 1936, oil on canvas. These are the low and sand hills near Ocald that many painters of the day tried to tackle as a subject. The subtle shifts in dramatic colors, as well as its monumental scale at first, proved to be a challenge to OKeefe. It was one of the reasons she persisted in returning to the site, trying to capture a fragment that reduced the hills to their essential form. From the Fairway nearby, 1937, oil on canvas. OKeefe exhibited this painting under the title Deer's Horns near Cameron in her retrospective exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1943. She visited Cameron, Arizona with photographer Ansel Adams in 1937, but thought this painting to be representative of the entire Southwest, what she referred to as the Faraway. In the summer of 1940, clearly retreating even further into the isolation of the desert, OKeefe settled in Ghost Ranch. Her small adobe house faced an imposing flat-topped mountain called the Pedernal. She painted this view many times over the decades. The White Place in Shadow, from The White Place, 1940, oil on canvas. The sedimentary rock across the Chema River was OKeefe's adobe house in Apicu, New Mexico, was unusually light for the region. The painter frequently renamed her favorite areas, and as soon as she found this particular site, she called it the White Place. OKeefe's love for simplicity showed clearly in her home. There were no paintings hung on the light adobe walls. Instead, there were stones, leaves, bones, and bits of nature lined up on the wide window ledge of her studio. Black Hills with Cedar, New Mexico, 1941, oil on canvas. Here OKeefe emphasizes the shadowy hollows of the hills. Unlike paintings that focus on the softly rounded swells, such as the earlier Gray Hill Farms. Eventually, as she grew more familiar with the site, the painter began to invent new hues to describe the patterns she was teasing out of the landscape. In 1943, OKeefe began a groundbreaking series of paintings inspired by the pelvis bones of animals. She found the pelvis ripe with natural curves and planes. At first, she floated the bones in infinite skies. Pelvis with Moon, 1943, oil on canvas. OKeefe became most intrigued by the holes in bones and what she saw through them, particularly the color blue, as she held them up against the sky. The artist believed these holes to be considerably expressive. Pelvis with Perdernal, 1943, oil on canvas. OKeefe referred to the bones she collected as striking to the center of something that is keenly alive on the desert, although it's vast and empty and untouchable and knows no kindness with all its beauty. Black Place Number 1, 1944, oil on canvas. OKeefe found this site about 150 miles northwest of Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, on the Jacara Apache Indian Reservation. Her early depictions are straightforward renderings of the low gray hills, as can be seen in her Gray Hill farms, which capture the elephantine feeling that she associated with them. Pelvis with Blue, Pelvis 1, 1944, oil on canvas. In the 1940s, when OKeefe saw what the young minimalist painters were doing with patterns of pure color, she realized that she had been working toward this ultimate simplification throughout her career, seeking that point where nothing turned into something. After Stieglitz died in 1946, OKeefe moved permanently to New Mexico. In the mid-1940s, OKeefe resumed her tree studies, this time capturing the cottonwoods of New Mexico. She turned also to the eerily beautiful forms of the dead hardwood trees of the desert, which remained standing long after they had ceased to live. Increasingly, she stripped her trees of any incidental detail, preferring their isolated silhouettes against the backdrop of sky, while honing in on the colors within the silvered bark. Bare Tree Trunks with Snow, 1946, oil on canvas. Though the trees are stripped of their leaves and are hibernating in the snow, their organic grouping still creates sensations inspired by the natural world. OKeefe began to travel extensively after World War II. During one trip to Mexico in 1951, she drove over 5,000 miles. Wall with Green Door, 1952, oil on canvas. From the flat intersecting plains of the Lake George barns to the stark adobe walls of New Mexico, surfaces and windows to the other places and worlds appear in OKeefe's work throughout her life. OKeefe took her first trip to Europe in 1953 and toured through France and Spain. Winter Cottonwoods, East Number 5, 1954, oil on canvas. This study evokes the same patterns as the 1924 Autumn Trees, the maple. Here, the earlier cool colors have been replaced with warm and softly silvered hues that capture the shimmering of light and the sensation of cottonwood leaves moving unceasingly into the breeze. In the spring of 1956, at the age of 69, she went to Peru. OKeefe loved the desert of the coast as she drove from Lima into the Andes to see the intricately organic Incan cities. OKeefe went for long visits to Japan and India in 1959 at the age of 72. Later, she traveled to Hong Kong, the Philippines, Cambodia, and the Pacific Islands. She also visited the Middle East, Baghdad, Beirut, and Jerusalem, and went to Egypt, Greece, and finally Italy. As an active, adventurous traveler, she even went rafting down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon several times. The paintings she created of these exotic locales are semi-abstract, postcard views, capturing the rhythm of the setting rather than focusing on the details of architecture and nature. Blue Bee, 1959, oil on canvas. While traveling by airplane during extensive worldwide trips, OKeefe enjoyed her bird's-eye view of the land. This abstract study, first in charcoal, then in oil, helped to formalize her distinctive sense of color into the patterns of landscapes. It was Blue and Green, 1960, oil on canvas. By 1960, O'Keefe had reduced the curves and sweeps of the New Mexico landscape to an abstract, almost minimal interpretation. Yet her work is still lush and organic, filled with the pulse of the living earth. Sky Above White Clouds 1, 1962, oil on canvas. This composition illustrates O'Keefe's resumed cloud studies, where focus were placed on the universals of the view of the sky from the ground. This can be considered the culmination of O'Keefe's quest for an underlying design with nature. With only the ephemeral images of clouds, their rich outlines and fine gradations, she had found the perfect subject for the abstraction of nature. O'Keefe's reductionist view was a way to find and observe the solid tangibles in life. There were things that endured despite changes in monumental events. In doing so, she captured infinite complexity in forms of infinite emptiness. O'Keefe explains, the meaning of a word, to me, is not as exact as the meaning of color. Color and shapes make a more definite statement than words. I write this because such odd things have been done about me with words. I have been often told what to paint. I am often amazed at the spoken and written word telling me what I have painted. I make this effort because no one else can know how my paintings happen. Where I was born and where and how I lived is unimportant. It is what I have done with where I have been that should be of interest. Sky Above Clouds 9, 1965, oil on canvas. This work, the largest canvas O'Keefe ever painted, was inspired by a 1962 series of cloudscapes. She completed the canvas when she was in her late 70s, yet it was not the crowning glory that she had been hoping for. Although the painting was the cornerstone of her 1970 Whitney exhibition, it is generally viewed by critics as a curiosity rather than a seminal work in the artist's oeuvre. O'Keefe's second major retrospective took place in 1970, after she had worked in comparative isolation for a number of years. For the first time, she was without the spotlight that Stieglitz had usually helped provide. Her lack of confidence, however, did not keep her from including a substantial body of new Southwestern studies among her 121 paintings, spanning the 55 years of her career. Black Rock with Blue Sky and White Clouds, 1972, oil on canvas. Despite the fact that she lost her central vision in the early 1970s, O'Keefe continued to work. Here, her active focus on sculpturing during this period is also reflected in two dimensions on canvas. O'Keefe's last trip was taken when she was 96. It was a return visit to the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. She continued to paint late into her life. A documentary film celebrating her 90th birthday shows her climbing briskly through the New Mexico desert, firmly attesting to her remarkable energy and longevity. Despite the fact that she had lost her central vision in the early 1970s, O'Keefe continued to work, turning her active focus to sculpture. O'Keefe reflects on learning how to work with clay. A young potter came to the ranch, and as I watched him work with the clay, I saw that he could make it speak. The pots that he made were beautiful shapes, very smooth, near to sculpture. I hadn't thought much about pottery, but now I thought that maybe I could make a pot too, maybe a beautiful pot. It could become still another language for me. I rolled the clay and coiled it, rolled it and coiled it. I tried to smooth it, and I made very bad pots. He said to me, keep on, you have to work at it. The clay has a mind of its own. He helped me with this and that, and I finally have several pots that are not too bad, but I cannot yet make the clay speak, so I must keep on. This portrays O'Keefe's determination as an artist, even in the later years of her life. During her lifetime, O'Keefe won countless honors and awards, including the Medal of Freedom. This is the highest American civilian honor, awarded by President Gerald Ford. O'Keefe was one of the most widely known painters in America. Using her peripheral vision and innate memory of the patterns of life, O'Keefe worked until the day she died on March 6, 1986, at the age of 98. Georgia O'Keeffe's death left behind a vast, nearly century-long body of work uniquely expressive of her singular vision of life. Her compositions were dependent on the details of her subjects, and their monumental quality lay in their transcendence from the particulars to the essence of the object. She remained faithful to this vision throughout her career. O'Keeffe never quite fit into the mainstream of the art world, but her works always seemed to express the same ideals that the popular theories were exploring. Her genius is that while she can be considered a modern artist, she showed her powerful vision through the subjects she painted, that being a truly traditional and durable means of expression. The normal, healthy part of America, and credits it as the foundation for the development of her art. Blue Lines 10, 1916, watercolor on paper. Stieglitz once referred to this painting as an embodiment of sexual principles, but for O'Keeffe, it was the ultimate in a series of linear abstractions. The lines and colors have been composed so that they impart a distinct message. This practice O'Keeffe called the very basis of painting. O'Keeffe's mother encouraged early art instruction for all 5 of her daughters, just as she herself and O'Keeffe's grandmother before her had. Evening Star 3, 1917, watercolor on paper. Beginning with pale washes that blended one into another, she gradually heightened the intensity of the color until the entire paper was saturated with pigment. She painted the sunlight falling on the vast plains at various times of day. She enjoyed harmonizing strident colors, using the force of her hues to convey the full impact of a spectacular sunset or sunrise. She even experimented in how far to separate the strokes in order to keep the tints pure. In 1918, Stieglitz managed to convince O'Keeffe to give up her teaching post in Texas and return to New York in order to paint. During her long and distinguished career, Georgia O'Keeffe pioneered an artistic style that dominated the art of 20th century America. Unique in its organic, abstract expression, her vision and passion identify her as a lifelong master of modern art. Born in the Midwest, O'Keeffe studied art in Virginia, Chicago, and eventually in New York City, where she came of age as an artist in the 1920s and 1930s. There, she soon became associated with photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz. He had recognized her talent from the start and immediately showed some of her work at his gallery, 291. Thus began a long, intense relationship, which was to benefit them both in their prolific and varied careers. With crystalline clarity and a vivid, sensuous feeling for both objects and landscapes, O'Keeffe painted life studies that were to distinguish her as an original and adventurous painter. Her studies of flowers, bones, cityscapes, and southwestern landscapes have become some of the most recognizable images in modern art, works of others. Dow wrote, "That which anybody can do is not worth doing. If your drawing is just like your neighbor's, it has no value as art." This belief became the foundation of O'Keeffe's art. That autumn in 1912, at the age of 25, OKeefe moved to Amarillo, Texas. She began teaching art for the first time for 2 years in a local high school. In 1914, at the age of 27, OKeefe joined the National Woman's Party. Although she never claimed to be a feminist, her early efforts towards equality were notable. In 1915, at the age of 28, while teaching art in South Carolina, OKeefe took stock of her career. The artist hung all her paintings in a room and performed a monumental self-evaluation of her work. OKeefe by then had studied at several schools around the country under notable teachers of the time. She concluded that each one of her paintings was derivative of these influences, and so destroyed every piece. The destruction of her paintings led OKeefe to produce a flurry of new drawings, done entirely in her singular expressionist way. In December of 1915, at the age of 28, she sent some of these spare abstract charcoal drawings to Anita Pulitzer. Pulitzer was struck by the promise and sensitiveness of the drawings. Though, after Stieglitz's death in 1946, OKeefe moved permanently to New Mexico, and in exploring her love of the natural world, found perhaps her truest expression in paint. Her reputation continued to grow, and her life devoted to art remains a great influence on American painting today. Rabbit and Copper Pot, Still Life with Hair, 1907, oil on canvas. This work is one of the rare extant paintings made while OKeefe was studying with William Merritt Chase at the Art Student League in New York. In 1923, OKeefe wrote of that time, "I loved the color in the brass and copper pots and pans, peppers, onions, and other things we painted for him." In 1910, at the age of 23, a severe bout of the measles temporarily blinded her, and she was forced to give up her career as a graphic artist. OKeefe returned to her family in Virginia to recover. OKeefe's first artistic crisis lasted until she was 24. In 1912, she enrolled briefly at the University of Virginia, where her sisters were taking art classes. Her sister encouraged her to come hear the revolutionary art instructor, Alain Bement. Alain Bement had studied the Dow method, which encouraged students to produce original work instead of copying. Though OKeefe had instructed her friend not to show the charcoal studies to anyone, Pulitzer took the drawings to Alfred Stieglitz. He was a noted photographer and one of America's foremost promoters of modern art. To Stieglitz, the drawings came as a revelation. He saw a new expression of things felt, a new beauty in OKeefe's work. He was so impressed that he exhibited her drawings without having first received OKeefe's permission. During a visit to New York, she descended on the gallery in anger and demanded that her private drawings be returned. Stieglitz persuaded her to allow the exhibit to remain standing. Abstraction 9, 1916, Charcoal on Paper. By 1916, OKeefe, a portraitist from an early age, was able to reduce the likeness of her fellow student and friend, Dorothy True, to a few essential forms. The swirling lines represent the ever-present cigarette smoke surrounding Dorothy. Yet this composition also displays the simple series of curves and shaded planes, representative of the painter's other early abstractions. OKeefe's love of nature was surely inspired by her childhood in Wisconsin. She was born on November 15, 1887 in Sun Prairie. She grew up among the hundreds of acres of her family's large dairy farm. She called her homeland in the Midwest